Yes.
Hello and welcome to R&D Unplugged number 3. Today's guest is Mônica Macedo. We're very honored to have her today. Mônica, without further ado, I hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Shahab. Thank you. Thanks a lot for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here to share some ideas on the learning transitions that affect our society with the members of the Learning Planet Institute and also from elsewhere here in the room and online. So let me introduce myself. My name is Mônica Macedo-Rouet. I'm a professor of educational psychology at the Institute for Teacher Training and Education in SPE from the University of Cergy. As a researcher, I'm interested in understanding how people read and learn from multiple sources of information, and how digital technologies affect these reading and learning processes, technologies such as the web and social media. We all know that there are many ways in which these technologies have changed our lives, and one of these ways is that they have facilitated access to an amazing amount of information. Anytime, anywhere, we're constantly receiving messages with different types of information from all kinds of sources. Our friends and family, the friends of our friends, our colleagues, teachers, the administration, commercial bodies, and also from unknown and familiar and unfamiliar sources, right? So how do we deal with all these sources? How do we decide whom to trust and whether what they say is reliable? And in this talk, I would like to present some key findings from international assessments on reading literacy and from research in educational and cognitive psychology on how people read in digital environments and why source evaluation is key for filtering fact from fiction. Let me begin with some results from the Program for International Student Assessment, the PISA study, conducted by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The PISA study involves more than 600,000 students from 79 countries, and these are 15-year-olds. Yeah, also I forgot to specify that this topic of source evaluation, because it's very large, I'm going to focus today on adolescents only, okay? Adolescents who are people from 10 to 19 years old, according to the World Health Organization. And why do I focus on adolescents? Because they're almost constantly connected to the internet and in some ways also more vulnerable to misinformation, okay? So let's take a look at the results from the PISA 2018 study. One of the questions that were asked to 15-year-olds were the frequency with which they had the opportunity to learn digital literacy skills at school. 54% of the students in the OECD countries said they had been trained to recognize biased information at school. Still, only 1 in 10 succeeded complex reading tasks, such as assessing information quality and credibility when reading about an unfamiliar topic. What does it mean concretely? Let me show you an example. This is a publicly released item from the PISA 2018. It's part of a larger reading unit in which it's a scenario in which an adolescent is looking for advice, looking for information and searching for advice on a web forum on how to raise chicken and how to deal with chicken health. And the question in this item is, who posted the most reliable answer to Ivana 88's question, which is, okay, hello everyone, is it okay to give aspirin to my hand? This is the thread starter in the forum. So to get the full credit for this question, the first thing the student has to do is to look at the users and what they said in the forum and to quickly discard 2 users in this forum. One is Bob towards the end. Sorry, I can't point. Yes, here. One is Bob, who doesn't really provide any advice. He just asks a question. And the other one is Avian Deals, who just wants to sell bird supplies. So he has a commercial interest in the topic. After that, the student has to can choose one of the three remaining users, but more precisely, he has to give relevant reasons for his or her choice. For example, if he chooses Nelly P79, he has to say that Nelly refers to an external expert to get advice, proper advice on whether we can give aspirin to hand the chicken. Or Moni, who provides experiential knowledge on the topic. Or even Frank, who states he has professional training and specialization in the topic. Of course, these criteria doesn't mean that they are perfectly reliable. We would still need to verify that, but it demonstrates that the student knows that it's important to not just see what the sources or the users are saying in the forum, but also who are them? What are their characteristics? Only 10% of the students in PISA 2018 were able to provide such justifications in all the evaluation items. Okay. Now, why do 15-year-olds have this difficulty with this type of evaluation items? Before I answer this question, the evaluation items, which refer to the source, of course. So before I answer the question, let me just briefly define what I'm calling a source, because it's an ambiguous word. It's differently defined in different disciplines. What I'm calling a source here refers to the origin of the information. It's where a document comes from. It's all the metadata about the origin, the context, and the purposes of information, which can be assessed through several cues, such as the date of publication, who the author is, and also the quality of the media in which the information was published. This medium has some editorial filters, editorial control before the information is published or not. So, for example, in this page, this web page about brain doping, the source would be the URL from the site, would be the name and the status of the author, the date in which the article was published, and also the references that are made to this website by other websites. Okay, this is the source. Now let's get back to my initial question. Why do adolescents not attend to sources while reading online, or at least not all the time? And not included. There has been a lot of research on this question in the last decades in reading and educational psychology. And I would like to present some three factors, in fact, that arise from this research and that are important to understand why adolescents do not attend to sources while reading. The first one is focus on content. When adolescents are reading and searching for information on the internet, they don't look at the source very spontaneously. Instead, they focus on the content of what is written in the page or in the messages in social media. And this figure shows the results. It's one example of a research conducted by the Stanford History Education Group. They have been doing a series of studies with thousands of high schoolers and middle schoolers and college students in the United States. And in this study, they asked students to evaluate 2 web pages on the topic of bullying at school. One of these pages came from a very reliable source, which was the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's a major scientific association, and this was the most reliable source. And the other one was the American College of Pediatrics, which is also seems like a reliable source, but it's a much smaller association, and it's an association that has an agenda about the topic of bullying at school. So it could not be considered as a reliable because it's a biased source. So when they asked the students to compare these 2 websites, what do the students do? First of all, they spend 10 minutes on average looking at the content of the article, reading through the article and trying to decide on the basis of what is written, whether the information is reliable or not. And at the end, 64% of the students chose, in fact, the biased source, the least reliable source from the two. We can contrast their answers with fact checkers' answers, fact checkers who are experienced informational professionals. The first thing they did when they were confronted with the same scenario was to get out of the website and try to find information about these two authors, these two associations. And at the end, 100% of them selected the most reliable source. So focusing on content is a problem for adolescents when they're reading online, when they're trying to determine the reliability of information.
It's the historians that are at least as worrying as the students, no? As an example.
Yes, also, exactly. The topics that are covered and they are vulnerable to are very important in some cases. So you do not want to choose the least reliable source, right, for some things. The second factor is a lack of motivation or a lack of prompting to evaluate source information. When evaluating sources is a costful process. You need to put a lot of effort into trying to understand who the author is, the quality of the medium, and adolescents are not always keen to do this kind of effort, at least not without prompting. This table is an example from a study that we have conducted with German and French adolescents from very different educational backgrounds. In Germany, it was the gymnasium, which is a selective track. In France, collège unique, open to everybody. And we found strikingly similarities between what the adolescents did when we gave them a small task to look at 4 web pages on the topic of aspartame to answer the following question: is aspartame bad for your health? And these websites were not all reliable. They were very different. And in their answers, as expected, they didn't mention the source. For example, one web source was from a major company that uses aspartame in their soft drinks. So there's a conflict of interest in that. And as expected, they didn't mention the source in their answers to the question. So after that, we interviewed them to say, look, did you see that these are different websites, different sources about this topic of aspartame, and they might not all be reliable about that? Oh, yes, I saw that. I saw that there is this company and so on. So why didn't you mention that? I say, well, but you didn't ask me to. Nobody ever tells me, look for the author. Or they said also, well, maybe it's a lot of effort to note all the sources and to look at them. So if they're not in the right conditions to look at the source, if they don't have explicit prompts to do that, they will not necessarily spontaneously look at the source. And even when they are prompted, adolescents do not always cite the source. In this other study conducted by Karita Kili and colleagues in Finland, they developed an environment to teach students to do online inquiry. And one of the phases was prompting them to cite the source. But after some hours of training on that, 1/3 of the students still did not include any explicit sources in their writing products about the questions they were trying to solve. Okay, this was for lack of motivation and prompting. And finally, the third factor is the use of inadequate criteria. Adolescents do not necessarily know when they have to evaluate sources. They don't necessarily know what to look for, how they can assess the reliability of a source. And this is an example from another study that we have conducted with high schoolers and middle schoolers. We gave them a bunch of small web pages that we manipulated so that each page contained a flaw. And one of these flaws was that the author was not an expert on the topic. This was, we asked them to imagine they had to do a project, a school project on climate change, on the causes of climate change more specifically. And they were looking for information for this project, reading these pages, and we asked them to say for each document if they found that it was reliable, if it was a good document for their project, and why. So in this document, the author, which is about causes of climate change, the author is a commercial computer engineer, not an expert on climate change. And only 3%, I don't know if you can see it here, only 3% of the students noticed that this author was not competent about the topic. And 3 other percent even said that she was a competent author. But most of them, 92%, didn't say anything about it. Then, in a second experiment, we asked them more explicitly, do you think that this author is knowledgeable about the topic? So high schoolers were able to distinguish the more competent authors from the other documents, which is in the blue bar. They had to give a score to the document, reliability score for the knowledgeable author. And they distinguished the knowledgeable authors, the more competent authors, from the least competent author. But middle schoolers couldn't do that. They provided their scores were not significantly different. So using these criteria is really not an easy task for adolescents. To sum up, filtering fact from fiction is a complex cognitive process. It's not just about reading for understanding. It's also about evaluating, being able to evaluate information and to integrate information from different pieces of information from different sources. And this is much more than just decoding words or understanding sentences. And beyond basic reading skills that we know are needed to do such things, students also need, for source evaluation, they need epistemic thinking. For example, reasoning about how knowledge is generated, how knowledge is deemed reliable in different domains. And this is something that develops gradually throughout our lives, right? And in the case of adolescents, they don't necessarily have sophisticated enough epistemic thinking to solve some informational problems. So for this reason, and also for other reasons, some authors have also suggested that because their brains are still developing, adolescents can be more vulnerable to misinformation online, even though they're not naive about sources and about information and about misinformation. And we saw that when you ask them, they are able to express a lot of reasoning and a lot of criteria, but do they do it spontaneously? We want them to do it spontaneously when they are reading and searching for information online. And this seems quite hard to achieve. The good news is that education can make a difference. Several studies that have been conducted in the last years show that even short-term trainings can improve adolescents' ability to evaluate sources. And one important thing that we are also finding out is that teacher-led interventions that are conducted with research-driven methods are effective to change. So it's very important to also involve teachers in a meaningful way in our research projects so that they understand what is being done and that they can participate more actively in this research and provide the right content with the right methods in class for the students. Now, of course, there are many questions that remain open. How can we take short-term experiments to scale? This is a big challenge because we need to have all kids having access to this kind of training on reading online and evaluating sources, but it's not so easy to do. And also, in terms of research, what's the best trade-off between naturalistic and controlled trials? We probably need both of them. We need more naturalistic observation, trying to understand how kids reason, what they do and why, but also controlled trials are important for strong evidence that allows us to move forward and develop efficient methods. So the trade-off between these two is something that we also need to discuss, and I will be delighted to discuss these issues with you. Thank you.
Nice quote.
Yeah, that's a question. Question for Mônica, either online or in the room.
Actually, I have two questions. The study that you did on German students and French students, was there a difference between their behavior? Because you mentioned the German students were actually selective.
Yeah, there were some differences, especially regarding their epistemic thinking.
Epistemic thinking.
Yeah, it's a series of epistemological beliefs that they have about how knowledge is generated, for example, in society, and how it can be judged, assessed in different disciplines, because, for example, some source factors like the date may not be evaluated the same way in history and in science or computer science. So we did find some differences in the way they explained how they thought about these things. But there were also a lot of differences. The German students didn't immediately spontaneously look at the source like the French ones. And this is something very recurrent, because if you start from a question, so if you don't say, okay, you're reading for evaluating, they will not spontaneously think of that. And this was very striking for us.
Okay. I actually have a second one, but I'll ask after I ask this question.
It's just what you just said. They were not, the task for them was not to evaluate, but they're in a specific context. They're in a class, and usually the teacher provides only verified information. How do you know that they would not act differently if they were not provided the document by the teacher?
Thanks for this question. Because we also asked it for ourselves, because reading in the sense that I'm presenting here is, it's not just about reading one text that someone gives you, a simple text, and you need to understand. Reading is, to me, is an activity that is inserted in a context in which you're reading for doing something. And the context might mean a lot on how we behave when we are reading. And we did conduct some research to understand that. It was an interview study in which we tried to discuss very freely with adolescents about what they did in real life every day when they were looking for information, starting from topics that they had answered in a questionnaire that they had said. We were focusing on science, which is a complex topic, not necessarily familiar to them. And so they were, but science in a large sense. For example, one student said, okay, I look for information on the internet to know if lime is good for your health and drinking lime juice. And say, okay, let's talk about that and talk about other scenarios. And in fact, there are some contexts in which they will more spontaneously look at the source. For example, if they're trying to solve a health problem individually or for a family member, then they won't take information from anybody. They will be more attentive to where the information comes from. But in other contexts, if they are reading for leisure, for example, they won't be as attentive to these matters. And even in a leisure context, you are also vulnerable to misinformation, right? So it's true that we need to find out more about how the context influences source evaluation and how can we transform that into pedagogical interventions that are meaningful also to their lives, that they will not just apply as a homework, but that they can apply these criteria, source evaluation criteria, in a meaningful way in other contexts. But I agree, the context influences.
I think Pleen had a question. Pleen, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Monica. My question was, how do you think the link between teachers and researchers can be made, considering the terrible institutional context, both on the researchers and teachers side?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. I don't know the answer, and I don't think there's one single answer to this question, but there are probably several things that need to be done. First of all, regarding formal education, so schools, we as researchers need to work more and more with educational authorities to try to include research in teachers' regular training, like long life training, and to organize well in advance the teacher training before we start conducting research in the classroom. If we want to involve the teachers, I think, need to understand what we are proposing, and also they have to get the feeling that it's also their problem and that they need to contribute and do something about that. Because usually when we're doing research, it's hard to have the time, right? So there are so many steps to be done. And the classroom setting is so complex. There are so many variables that affect learning at school that we don't usually work well in advance with the teachers to build these skills and these shared ground. So I think this is one important thing, to build a shared background between teachers and researchers before we implement interventions. I don't know if I answered your question right.
Thank you.
Sorry. Ariel.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I just read an article a few days ago on Nature saying that misinformation is actually a much bigger threat to democracy than previously thought. And in that paper, they articulate that there are ways to prevent some of that misinformation to happen by, and I quote, inoculating, by different methods of inoculating people, which is very interesting given the fact that there's several biologists here. It's a very interesting metaphor regarding how a body can defend against viruses, etc. So I was just wondering, there's two different kinds of inoculation. I can't remember the details. Are you familiar with this sort of things? Have you tried experiment where you try to somehow prevent or prepare the defense or the intellectual defense of the students or the adolescents before reading something? You've done some experiment before?
We haven't done it directly in this sense. Inoculation is a very well-known and old theory in communication studies. For example, in the 80s, I think, or 70s, there was this theory about hypodermic hypodermic needle to talk about how media could inoculate some ideas on people. I don't think that there are some interesting proposals that go on this sense. There's a very well-known Canadian author who's a researcher and also a teacher, I think, that has a program. He developed a program which is called, I can remember the name now, auto defense against misinformation on the internet. But I don't think it's just a matter of protecting people and adolescents particularly against misinformation. I don't think this is what we want. We want them to, because there's also no such things in all cases, like the wrong information and the correct information, or the good information, the totally reliable and totally unreliable. Of course, fake news is something that we can say is totally unreliable, but in misinformation, there is a continuum. And we don't want them just to discard information. We want them to reason about information and be able to take a reflective stance on that. Why some information can be reliable in one context, but not in another, or reliable for some things, or not very dangerous if we do it in one context, but not in another. So inoculating, I think, is not enough. I think we need to train and educate adolescents to reflect on this information and on written information particularly.
I think Ariel was next, and then we have Ignacio. Ariel.
I have tens of questions. Okay? So thanks for your talk, because it really raises a lot of questions. I'll start with maybe just one or two of them. The first one is sort of on the basic understanding of an adolescent, and cognitively wise, what are they capable of and what they're not capable of in their cognitive trajectory. Okay, so is there proof that if we do the right actions, they will be sort of perfect fact checkers, or is there something inherent in adolescence that whatever we do, right, there's always some other cues that will trump it, right? For example, the fact that they get social cues, right? So they get their data, they get their knowledge through an Insta, and if they trust the person that sends it, right, then they send it, right? So we get these bubbles, etc. So is there basically, I'm saying, so is there a fight worth doing, or it's a lost fight to start with, and we have to think of something else? That's sort of the ground, my ground question. I then have many others.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I don't think it's a lost fight. There is, regarding a source evaluation, we don't know everything yet in developmental terms, what they are able to do in each, at each age or developmental level. But there is evidence that kids can already take a critical stance on sources when they are very young. For example, some developmental psychologist, a psychologist called Laupa, she has done studies with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, asking in an oral interaction context if they would take orders from adults in school. And kids, since 3-year-olds are able to distinguish the teacher from the seller on the other corner of the street, they give an order, so they wouldn't obey, or they wouldn't follow the order by the seller. They would for the teacher. So it shows that they can do that. But when the reading on the internet is another thing, because oral interactions provide us cues about the credibility of the source, right? You have the age of the person, you have visuals, you have the status that we know is in the local context that you're familiar with, and reading and critically evaluating information in written form is much more complex. So probably this needs to be done much more progressively and later in the developmental cycle. But we have done things with fifth graders, for example.
No, I actually think that there is something that we lose over time from 3-year-old to 15-year-old rather than everything goes sort of in a developmental way. I mean, in a positive way. But I ask maybe differently. I mean, so there's a very rich, I mean, I read a bit about your work, but many others, very rich literature on different interventions, right? And what is considered sort of the best intervention possible, and what success rate it has for teenagers? Is it sort of 50% at most manage to learn well how to find it, right? Or there is an intervention that in some cases they reach beyond 50%. And so that is sort of promising, but it's still 50% of those that were high raters, right, in high schoolers managed somewhat better, right? But it's still way beyond to have sort of a immune collective system in which fake news would not propagate, right? There is a sort of people that we need to make sure that they do the things right in order to damp fake news. So is there an intervention that actually works?
My answer is, I don't know. And I think that if someone knew that, he would be rich at this moment. I'm finishing a revision of a paper that we want to publish in Instructional Science about a proposal for it's an intervention study in which we propose an analytical method to evaluate sources with criteria and organizing it against other methods that use, for example, a whole task approach in which the adolescents like do all the steps of information search and evaluation at the same time, and also others that focused on one single strategy, so teaching one strategy at a time and making things grow little by little. But in all these studies, there are some things that work well and others don't. Some skills progress a lot with some of these and others don't, and it's not the same skills in all the methods. So I think we still have a long way to go until we know what method works best.
We're running a little bit out of time. We had Ignacio, can you keep it short, please? Please unmute.
Hi, Monica. Thank you so much for this presentation. Quick question. So regarding the effectiveness of potential interventions, what are usually the outcomes or indicators that are used to assess whether an intervention is effective or not? Is it, for instance, task like the one shown in PISA? Or other kind of tasks? And second question, what do you think about those indicators, and do you think they are actually measuring the capacity of students to filter fact from fiction?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are many indicators. One is performance to evaluation questions, being able to distinguish reliable from least reliable sources. But there's also what we call online measures. How do they process information? So the time, we know that there are significant correlations between the time they spent evaluating or the time they spend reading and their ability to evaluate. Also, eye movements have been used to study the attention that is allocated to source information in web documents, in web pages. And it has also been used as a training method. For example, to show, this is a work by a colleague from the University of Valencia, Lalo Salmeron. They are using videos of eye tracking, so tracking the movements of the eye to show the strategies by a good evaluator and a less good evaluator to teach kids how to evaluate information. And I think these are promising ways, but there's no, I think, single measure that can tell us whether an adolescent is a performing evaluator. I like a lot to work also with justifications, how they express their answer to a score that they provided for a document. I think the justifications are also very important to understand what they are thinking, how they reason, and the quality, to assess the quality of their answers, because it's not just because you distinguished a reliable from a least reliable source that you're a good evaluator. Still, it depends on why you assessed it like that. So I think it's important to work on their justifications and interview them to know more about that.
Was there a final question, Maria Angelica?
I would like to ask you, since which framework you are working on, because you spoke about the contest, since the critical discourse analysis have other kind of dimensions that are considered when you rate one test, so the textual, but the socio-cognitive, and also the societal. I would like to know since which perspective you are working on.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you for this question. There are several theories that I use, but one of the main theoretical frameworks that I'm following is called Resolve, is reading for problem solving. It's more a cognitive approach to reading, and it's a theory that tries to define reading as an activity that goes well beyond decoding words and understanding sentences, and tries to describe the processes, the cognitive processes that take place when the reader is looking for information, to answer a question, and including the context in which he or she is inserted. So it's more this cognitive approach that I use.
Any final question?
No. Yeah, I'm sorry. Do you plan to extend your research to a younger population, kids from primary school, for instance?
I have done work with younger kids, fifth graders and sixth graders. I think there are many interesting things to do in primary school. Lately, my research was more with older adolescents, like first year university students or secondary grades, because it's also there that you have more opportunities to include interventions on these this kind of things. But I'm open to suggestions or collaborations.
Thank you.
And sorry, I forgot to mention the authors from the theory. It's Mary and Britt, if you are interested in concerning your question. After.
All right. I think this is it for the R&D Unplugged number 3. Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Monica.